I can't tell you who I am, and I won't reveal how I came to possess this information. There are people still alive who would prefer these details remain buried with the victims. But after 67 years of silence, the full truth about Edward Theodore Gein needs to be told. What you think you know about the Butcher of Plainfield barely scratches the surface of what really happened in that isolated Wisconsin farmhouse in 1957. My connection to this case runs deeper than I can safely admit. Let us just say that certain documents found their way to me through channels that law enforcement would rather not acknowledge. Files that were sealed, testimonies that were buried, and evidence that mysteriously disappeared from the Washoe County Sheriff's Office. The official story you've heard is sanitized, carefully crafted to protect reputations and avoid uncomfortable questions about how a man could commit such atrocities for years without anyone noticing or caring. Before we dive into the nightmare that was Ed Gein's world, let me share something that will chill you to the bone. According to my sources, Gein's farm wasn't just the scene of his crimes. It was a carefully orchestrated laboratory of human experimentation that went on for nearly a decade. The two confirmed murders of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan were just the tip of an iceberg that authorities desperately wanted to keep submerged. Plainfield, Wisconsin, population 647 in 1957, seemed like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Nestled in the heart of dairy country, surrounded by rolling farmland and dense forests, it was the epitome of small-town America. Neighbors knew neighbors, doors were left unlocked, and the most exciting event of the year was the annual Harvest Festival. But beneath this Norman Rockwell exterior festered a darkness so profound that it would forever change how America viewed its quiet rural communities. The Gein family farm sat on 160 acres of isolation, 7 miles from Plainfield's modest downtown. To passing travelers on the dirt road, it looked abandoned, paint peeling from the weathered clapboard siding, broken windows patched with cardboard, and an overwhelming stench that locals attributed to poor sanitation. What they didn't know was that this decay masked horrors beyond human comprehension. According to documents I've obtained, neighbors had been complaining about strange odors and unusual activities at the Gein farm since 1954, but their concerns were consistently dismissed by local authorities. The man at the center of this nightmare was born August 27, 1906, to George and Augusta Gein. To understand the monster Ed became, you must first understand the woman who created him. Augusta Gein wasn't just religious, she was fanatically obsessed with sin, death, and the corruption of the human body. She preached fire and brimstone from dawn to dusk, filling young Ed's mind with twisted interpretations of scripture that portrayed women as vessels of evil and the human body as inherently corrupt. Here as something the official reports won't tell you. Augusta didn't just psychologically abuse her son, she conducted what can only be described as ritualistic punishments. According to a sealed psychiatric evaluation obtained, Gein described sessions where his mother would lock him in a closet for hours while reading graphic passages from the Book of Revelation, specifically focusing on descriptions of bodily corruption and resurrection. She told him repeatedly that all women except her were instruments of the devil, and that the only pure woman was a dead woman. When Augusta suffered her first stroke in 1944, Ed became her full-time caregiver. But instead of resenting this burden, he embraced it with disturbing enthusiasm. Witnesses I've spoken to, people who are still alive but refuse to go on record, described seeing Ed talking to Augusta long after her death in 1945, setting places for her at dinner, and maintaining elaborate conversations with her corpse. The official record states that Augusta died of natural causes, but medical documents that surfaced years later suggest she may have died from deliberately withheld medication. Ed wanted his mother to himself forever. The death of Augusta Gein on December 29, 1945, marked the beginning of what investigators would later call Eddie's experimental period. Left alone in the decaying farmhouse, with no social connections and a mind shattered by decades of psychological abuse, Gein began his descent into a madness so complete that it defies rational explanation. But this wasn't random insanity, it was methodical, purposeful, and guided by a twisted logic that only made sense within the confines of his diseased mind. What happened next challenges everything we think we know about the development of serial killers. Rather than immediately turning to murder, Gein spent nearly 2 years perfecting the art of grave robbery. Between 1947 and 1954, he made dozens of nocturnal visits to local cemeteries, targeting recently buried middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. But this wasn't simple necrophilia or random desecration according to documents I've obtained from the original investigation. Gein was following specific patterns based on astrological charts and weather conditions. If you're finding this hard to believe, you're not alone. But consider this. When investigators finally searched Gein's property, they found detailed journals documenting every grave he'd visited, complete with sketches of the bodies and notes about their condition. These journals, which were never made public, reveal a mind operating according to its own horrific logic. Gein wasn't just stealing bodies, he was collecting raw materials for projects that would make even seasoned homicide detectives physically ill. I need to pause here because what you about to hear represents the first call to action of our investigation. If you are someone who appreciates true crime content that goes beyond the sanitized versions you find elsewhere, you need to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. The information I'm sharing with you tonight has never been released publicly, and there are people who would prefer it stays that way. By subscribing, you not just supporting independent journalism, you helping ensure that stories like Ed Gein's are told in their full, unvarnished truth. The rabbit hole we're about to go down gets much deeper, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The first confirmed murder attributed to Ed Gein occurred on December 8, 1954, though evidence suggests this may not have been his first kill. Mary Hogan, a 54-year-old tavern owner from nearby Pine Grove, disappeared from her establishment under circumstances that should have immediately raised red flags. The official investigation was cursory at best, hampered by what I've learned was deliberate obstruction from local officials who had their own reasons for wanting certain questions left unasked. Mary Hogan's Tavern was more than just a drinking establishment, it was an information hub where locals gathered to share gossip, conduct business, and socialize. Mary knew everyone's secrets, and according to sources I've spoken with, she wasn't shy about using that information when it suited her purposes. On the night she disappeared, several patrons reported seeing a strange man lingering outside the tavern for hours, watching through the windows with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. That man was Ed Gein. The crime scene told a story that investigators either couldn't or wouldn't piece together properly. Blood spatter patterns indicated that Mary had been shot at close range while behind the bar, but the trajectory suggested the killer was significantly shorter than Mary's 5'6" frame. This detail was noted but never pursued, despite the fact that Ed Gein stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall. More tellingly, drag marks leading from the tavern to the parking area showed that Mary's body had been moved by someone who lacked the strength to carry her, requiring multiple stops and repositioning. But here's what really should have broken the case wide open. Mary Hogan's car was found abandoned 3 miles from the tavern, but local mechanic records show that the vehicle had been driven nearly 40 miles based on the odometer reading. Where did those extra miles come from? According to documents I've obtained, the answer leads directly back to Gein's farm, but this connection was never officially pursued. The investigation was closed after 6 weeks, with Mary Hogan officially classified as a missing person despite clear evidence of foul play. The real breakthrough in understanding Gein's methodology came from analyzing his second confirmed victim, Bernice Worden. On November 16, 1957, Bernice was working alone at Worden Hardware Store when Ed Gein entered shortly after 8 a.m. According to her son Frank, who was deputy sheriff at the time, his mother had mentioned feeling uncomfortable around Gein during his previous visits to the store. She described him as odd and noted that he would stare at her in a way that made her skin crawl. What happened next was captured in a sales receipt that would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. Gein purchased a half-gallon of antifreeze, paying with exact change and engaging in witnesses described as unusually animated conversation about hunting season. But here's the detail that was never released to the public. Bernice Worden's handwriting on that receipt shows clear signs of distress. According to handwriting analysis documents I've obtained, the pressure and formation of letters indicate she was writing under extreme duress, possibly with a weapon pointed at her. The timeline of Bernice Worden's murder reveals the calculated nature of Gein's crimes. Store records show that Gein had visited Worden Hardware at least 6 times in the previous month, always when Bernice was working alone, always purchasing small items that didn't require his presence. He was clearly conducting surveillance, learning her routines and identifying the optimal time to strike. This wasn't the random act of a madman, it was a carefully planned abduction that Gein had been orchestrating for weeks. When Bernice Worden failed to return home that evening, her son Frank immediately suspected foul play. As deputy sheriff, he had access to investigative resources that had been lacking in the Mary Hogan case. The sales receipt with Gein's name provided the first solid lead, but what Frank discovered when he arrived at the Gein farm exceeded his worst nightmares. Even seasoned law enforcement officers, men who had seen combat in World War II and dealt with violent crime throughout their careers, were physically sickened by what they found. The official police report describes finding Bernice Worden's decapitated corpse hanging upside down in Gein's shed, but this clinical description fails to capture the full horror of the scene. According to eyewitness accounts I've obtained, Worden's body had been dressed and processed like a deer, with precision cuts that indicated extensive anatomical knowledge. This wasn't the work of a deranged farmer, it was the methodical butchering performed by someone who understood human anatomy with surgical precision. But Bernice Worden's corpse was just the beginning. As investigators moved through Gein's farmhouse, they discovered a collection of human remains and artifacts that challenged everything they thought they knew about criminal behavior. Skulls used as bowls, chairs upholstered with human skin, lampshades made from faces, and clothing fashioned from women's torsos. The inventory list, which has never been made public in its entirety, runs to over 40 pages of meticulously cataloged human remains. What makes this discovery even more disturbing is the evidence of long-term planning and organization. These weren't random trophies collected in moments of madness, they were carefully crafted objects that Gein had been creating and refining for years. According to forensic analysis conducted at the time, some of the remains showed signs of preservation techniques that indicated extensive experimentation with different methods of tissue treatment. Gein wasn't just collecting bodies, he was perfecting the art of human taxidermy. The psychological evaluation of Ed Gein, conducted by Dr. Edward Kelleher at the Central State Hospital, provides insights into the mind of a killer that are both fascinating and terrifying. Unlike many serial killers who attempt to minimize or justify their actions, Gein was remarkably forthcoming about his motivations and methods. He described his crimes not as acts of violence, but as necessary steps in a larger project aimed at achieving spiritual unity with his deceased mother. According to sealed psychiatric records I've obtained, Gein believed that by wearing the skin and organs of women who resembled his mother, he could literally become her. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. Gein genuinely believed in a form of physical transformation that would allow him to merge with Augusta's spirit. He described elaborate rituals involving the assumption of female identities, complete with makeshift clothing and carefully applied makeup made from human blood and tissue. But here's the detail that investigators found most disturbing. Gein's crimes weren't driven by sexual motivation in any conventional sense. Instead, they were part of an elaborate religious ritual based on his mother's twisted interpretation of Christian resurrection doctrine. Gein believed that by reconstructing human bodies using parts from multiple sources, he could create vessels worthy of containing divine spirits. In his delusional mind, he wasn't committing murder, he was performing acts of sacred creation. The trial of Ed Gein began on November 7, 1968, more than a decade after his arrest. This delay was due to extensive psychiatric evaluation and legal maneuvering that kept many details of the case sealed from public view. What emerged during testimony was a portrait of a man so completely detached from reality that traditional concepts of legal responsibility seemed inadequate. Gein's defense team argued for insanity, while prosecutors pushed for murder convictions that would ensure he never returned to society. But the trial also revealed disturbing questions about local law enforcement's handling of the case. Why had complaints about strange odors and activities at the Gein farm been ignored for years? How had dozens of grave robberies gone unnoticed or uninvestigated? And most troublingly, why did several key pieces of evidence mysteriously disappear from police custody before the trial began? According to court transcripts I've obtained, at least 3 witnesses who were scheduled to testify about pre-1957 encounters with Gein either refused to appear or suddenly changed their stories. One local farmer who had initially claimed to see Gein digging in the Plainfield cemetery on multiple occasions later testified that he must have been mistaken. Another witness, who reported finding human remains on property adjacent to Gein's farm, recanted his statement entirely, claiming he had been drinking and imagined the whole thing. These inconsistencies point to a troubling possibility that Ed Gein's crimes were an open secret in Plainfield, tolerated or ignored by a community that found it easier to look the other way than confront the reality of what was happening in their midst. The isolation that allowed Gein to operate undetected wasn't just geographic, it was social and institutional, a conspiracy of willful blindness that enabled his crimes to continue for years. Now, I need to address something directly with you, the viewer. This channel exists because mainstream media refuses to ask the hard questions about cases like Ed Gein's. While other content creators stick to the sanitized version of events, we dig deeper, uncovering documents and testimonies that others won't touch. If you value this kind of investigative work, please take a moment to hit the like button and consider sharing this video with others who appreciate true crime content that goes beyond surface-level sensationalism. We have dozens of similar cases in our archives, each one revealing uncomfortable truths about how our justice system handles its most disturbing criminals. Your support allows us to continue this important work. The psychiatric evaluation that ultimately determined Gein's fate revealed a mind operating according to logic so twisted that even experienced forensic psychologists struggled to comprehend it. Dr. Kelleher's report, portions of which were sealed for decades, describes a patient who showed no remorse for his actions, but also no real understanding of why others found them disturbing. To Gein, he had been performing necessary work, following instructions received through spiritual communication with his dead mother. During these sessions, Gein described in detail his process for selecting and acquiring victims. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were random targets. They were specifically chosen because they possessed physical characteristics that reminded him of Augusta Gein at different stages of her life. According to the psychiatric notes, Gein had been observing and cataloging local women for years, creating detailed profiles of their habits, schedules, and vulnerabilities. But perhaps most disturbing was Gein's description of his ultimate goal. He claimed to be working toward creating a perfect replica of his mother, using the best parts from multiple sources. This was necrophilia, or cannibalism in any conventional sense. It was an attempt to literally resurrect Augusta Gein through a combination of human taxidermy and what he believed to be divine intervention. The skin suit found at his farm wasn't a trophy or disguise, it was a religious vestment designed to facilitate communication with the spirit world. The forensic evidence supported these psychiatric findings in ways that were deeply unsettling. Analysis of the remains found at Gein's farm revealed that he had been experimenting with different preservation techniques for years, gradually perfecting methods for maintaining human tissue in wearable condition. Some pieces showed evidence of repeated use and repair, indicating that Gein had been regularly wearing his gruesome creations during private rituals. More disturbing still were the tools and equipment found in Gein's workshop. These weren't the crude implements one might expect from a deranged farmer. but rather sophisticated instruments for precision cutting and tissue manipulation. Several items appeared to be medical instruments, leading investigators to wonder where Gein had acquired such specialized equipment. This question was never adequately answered, despite its obvious importance to understanding the scope of his crimes. The impact of Ed Gein's crimes extended far beyond Plainfield's borders, fundamentally changing how Americans viewed their rural communities and the people who lived in them. The notion that such horrors could unfold in small-town America, undetected and unchallenged for years, shattered the myth of rural innocence that had been central to American identity since the nation's founding. Hollywood seized on this cultural anxiety almost immediately. Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, published just 2 years after Gein's arrest, drew heavily on details from the case, creating the character of Norman Bates as a fictionalized version of the Plainfield Butcher. Alfred Hitchcock's subsequent film adaptation brought Gein's influence to mainstream audiences, though the sanitized version bore little resemblance to the genuine horror of the original crimes. But Psycho was just the beginning. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chain Saw Massacre drew even more directly from Gein's story, incorporating specific details like furniture made from human remains and the killer's use of human skin as clothing. Later films like The Silence of the Lambs and Psycho House continued to mine Gein's crimes for inspiration, creating a cultural legacy that far exceeded the original case's notoriety. This Hollywood attention, while bringing Ed Gein's name to international recognition, also served to obscure the real story behind the crimes. The fictional versions were designed to entertain rather than inform, smoothing over the disturbing questions about institutional failure and community complicity that the actual case raised. As a result, most people know Ed Gein as a pop culture reference rather than understanding the genuine horror of what happened in Plainfield. The real Ed Gein remained institutionalized at the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane until his death on July 26, 1984. During his 26 years of confinement, he became something of a celebrity among fellow inmates and staff, known for his mild manner and apparent normalcy. Visitors described him as polite, articulate, and seemingly harmless, a far cry from the monster who had terrorized Wisconsin decades earlier. But this transformation raises troubling questions about the nature of evil and mental illness. Was Gein genuinely rehabilitated, or had he simply learned to mask his true nature more effectively? According to medical records I've obtained, he continued to experience vivid hallucinations involving his mother throughout his incarceration, suggesting that his fundamental delusions remained intact despite psychiatric treatment. More disturbing were reports from other inmates claiming that Gein would sometimes act out elaborate rituals in his cell, using makeshift materials to recreate the ceremonies he had performed at his farm. These accounts were never officially investigated, dismissed as the ravings of mentally ill criminals seeking attention. But they raised the possibility that Ed Gein never truly understood the enormity of his crimes, remaining trapped in the same delusional world that had driven him to murder. The investigation into Ed Gein's crimes officially concluded with his institutionalization, but many questions remained unanswered. The fate of other missing persons from the region during the 1950s was never adequately explored, despite evidence suggesting that Gein's confirmed victims might represent only a fraction of his actual crimes. Several families reported loved ones who had disappeared under circumstances similar to those surrounding Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, but these cases were never reopened. According to documents I've obtained, at least 7 women from central Wisconsin went missing between 1947 and 1957, all fitting the profile of Gein's known victims. These women were middle-aged, lived alone, and disappeared under circumstances that suggested abduction rather than voluntary departure. Yet none of these cases were ever connected to Gein, despite the obvious similarities and his presence in the general area when the disappearances occurred. The reasons for this investigative failure are complex and troubling. Part of the problem was jurisdictional. The disappearances occurred across multiple counties, and communication between law enforcement agencies was limited. But there's also evidence of deliberate suppression of information, driven by a desire to avoid the negative publicity that additional Gein victims would bring to the region. Local business leaders and politicians had a vested interest in containing the damage to Wisconsin's reputation. The state's economy depended heavily on tourism and agriculture, both of which could be severely impacted by association with serial murder. According to internal memos I've obtained from the Wisconsin State Police, there was explicit pressure from above to limit the scope of the Gein investigation and avoid pursuing leads that might implicate him in additional crimes. This institutional cover-up had devastating consequences for the families of the missing women. Without official acknowledgement of possible connections to Gein, they were left to pursue their own investigations, often encountering resistance and obstruction from the very authorities who should have been helping them. Several families hired private investigators, but these efforts were hampered by lack of access to evidence and witness testimony that remained sealed in official files. The property where Ed Gein committed his crimes became a source of fascination and controversy that continues to this day. After his arrest, the farmhouse and outbuildings were sealed by authorities, but curious tourists and souvenir hunters regularly trespass on the property. Local officials, frustrated by the continued attention and concerned about public safety, eventually made the decision to burn down the structures in 1958. But even this drastic action failed to end the property's dark legacy. According to local residents I've spoken with, strange phenomena began occurring on the land shortly after the fire. Visitors reported hearing voices, seeing unexplained lights, and experiencing overwhelming feelings of dread and nausea. While skeptics dismiss these accounts, imagination, or publicity seeking, the consistency of the reports suggests something more substantial. The land changed hands several times over the following decades, but no owner has ever managed to develop it successfully. Plans for residential development, commercial use, and even agricultural operations have all failed, usually due to unexplained technical problems or accidents that drove investors away. As of 2024, the property remains largely undeveloped, marked only by a small memorial to Gein's victims that is regularly vandalized or destroyed by unknown parties. What makes these ongoing mysteries more significant is their connection to evidence that was never recovered from the Gein investigation. According to sources who worked on the original case, several boxes of materials from the farmhouse were never processed or cataloged, instead being stored in a warehouse that was later destroyed by fire in 1963. The timing of this fire, just as renewed interest in the case was emerging, has led some to suspect arson designed to eliminate embarrassing evidence. Before we conclude tonight's investigation, I want to pose a question directly to you, our viewers. Given what you've learned about the Ed Gein case, do you believe justice was truly served? Was institutionalization appropriate for someone who committed such heinous crimes? Or should he have faced execution like many serial killers of his era? More troubling still, do you think there are other Ed Geins out there right now, operating in isolated communities where their crimes might go undetected for years or decades? These aren't just abstract questions, they go to the heart of how our society identifies and responds to extreme criminal behavior. The Gein case revealed profound failures in multiple systems: law enforcement, mental health, and community oversight. Have we learned from these failures, or are we still vulnerable to similar horrors? I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't hesitate to share this video with others who might have insights or experience that is relevant to these questions. Your engagement with this content isn't just entertainment, it's part of an ongoing conversation about justice, safety, and the nature of evil itself. By watching, commenting, and sharing, you're helping ensure that cases like Ed Gein's continue to be examined and understood, rather than forgotten or sanitized into harmless fiction. The psychological profile that emerged from Ed Gein's case became a template for understanding similar criminals, but it also revealed how little we truly comprehend about the development of extreme antisocial behavior. Unlike typical serial killers who escalate gradually from minor crimes to murder, Gein seemed to emerge fully formed as a monster, suggesting that traditional models of criminal development might be inadequate for understanding the most extreme cases. Dr. Kelleher's analysis identified several factors that contributed to Gein's pathology: severe maternal psychological abuse, social isolation, religious extremism, and possible organic brain damage from childhood illness. But thousands of individuals experience similar circumstances without becoming murderers, raising questions about what ultimately triggers the transformation from victim to victimizer. The answer might lie in factors that were never adequately explored during the original investigation. According to psychiatric records I've obtained, Gein reported experiencing significant head trauma during childhood, including at least 2 incidents where he lost consciousness for extended periods. Modern research has established clear connections between traumatic brain injury and violent behavior, but this avenue was never thoroughly investigated in Gein's case. Similarly, his reports of hearing voices and experiencing visions were dismissed as symptoms of schizophrenia rather than being examined as potential indicators of neurological damage. The religious component of Gein's delusions also deserves closer examination. Augusta Gein's interpretation of Christianity was so extreme that it bordered on heretical, incorporating elements of death worship and bodily resurrection that had more in common with ancient pagan religions than mainstream Christian doctrine. Where did these beliefs originate, and how did they shape Eddie's developing worldview? These questions were never adequately addressed, despite their obvious relevance to understanding his crimes. The influence of Ed Gein on popular culture extends far beyond the horror movies that made him famous. His case fundamentally changed how Americans thought about mental illness, rural life, and the potential for evil to hide in plain sight. The archetype he established, the quiet, unassuming neighbor who conceals unspeakable horrors, became a recurring theme in American fiction and film, reflecting deeper anxieties about trust and safety in modern society. But this cultural impact has come at a cost. The focus on Gein as a source of entertainment has obscured the very real lessons his case offers about preventing similar crimes. The warning signs were there for years: the strange odors, the antisocial behavior, the complaints from neighbors and community members. Yet these indicators were consistently ignored or dismissed, allowing Gein to continue his activities unimpeded. Modern criminal profiling techniques, had they existed in the 1950s, might have identified Gein as a high-risk individual years before he committed murder. His pattern of grave robbing, social isolation, and obsession with death were all consistent with what we now recognize as precursors to violent crime. But these connections weren't understood at the time, and the lessons learned from his case came too late to prevent other similar tragedies. The forensic examination of evidence from the Gein farm revealed techniques and methods that were decades ahead of their time in terms of sophistication and precision. This raises disturbing questions about where Gein acquired his knowledge of human anatomy and preservation techniques. His formal education was limited, and he had no known medical training, yet the quality of his work suggested extensive study and practice. According to documents I've obtained, investigators found several medical textbooks and anatomical diagrams among Gein's possessions, but the source of these materials was never determined. Some appeared to be current publications that would have been difficult for a rural farmer to obtain through normal channels. This suggests that Gein may have had access to educational or medical resources that were inapparent to investigators, possibly through connections that were never explored. The preservation techniques used on the human remains found at Gein's farm also showed evidence of chemical knowledge that exceeded what a layperson might reasonably possess. Analysis revealed the use of specialized compounds for tissue treatment that were typically available only to funeral directors, medical professionals, or biological researchers. How did Gein obtain these materials, and where did he learn to use them effectively? These questions become more troubling when considered in the context of Gein's careful planning and methodical approach to his crimes. This wasn't the random violence of a madman. but rather the calculated behavior of someone who had studied his craft extensively. The implications of this realization extend far beyond the Gein case itself, suggesting that similar crimes might be more planned and sophisticated than commonly understood. The institutional response to Ed Gein's crimes revealed systemic problems that extend well beyond the specifics of his case. The failure to investigate earlier warning signs, the suppression of evidence that might have revealed additional victims, and the reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions about community complicity all point to deeper issues with how society handles its most disturbing criminals. Part of the problem lies in the tendency to treat extreme crimes as aberrations rather than symptoms of broader social problems. By focusing exclusively on Gein as an individual monster, investigators and analysts avoided confronting the environmental factors that enabled his crimes. The isolation, poverty, and social dysfunction that characterized rural Wisconsin in the 1950s created ideal conditions for predators to operate undetected. Similarly, the emphasis on Gein's mental illness obscured questions about the role of community institutions in preventing or enabling his crimes. Churches, schools, social services, and law enforcement all had opportunities to intervene before his behavior escalated to murder, but none of these systems functioned effectively in his case. Understanding why these safeguards failed is crucial to preventing similar tragedies in the future. The treatment of Gein's victims and their families also reveals troubling attitudes about who deserves protection and justice. Both Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden were middle-aged women living independently, demographics that were often marginalized or overlooked by male-dominated law enforcement agencies. Would the response have been different if the victims had been younger, more conventionally attractive, or from more prominent families? As we reach the conclusion of our investigation into the Ed Gein case, it's important to recognize that many questions remain unanswered more than 6 decades after his arrest. The true scope of his crimes, the number of his victims, and the extent of institutional cover-up may never be fully known. What we can say with certainty is that Ed Gein represents something far more disturbing than a simple case of mental illness or criminal deviance. His story reveals the potential for evil to flourish in environments where isolation, dysfunction, and willful blindness create perfect conditions for predators to operate. The lessons of Plainfield extend far beyond the specifics of Gein's crimes, offering insights into how communities can better protect themselves from similar threats. But only if we are willing to confront uncomfortable truths about our own capacity for enabling evil through inaction and denial. The Butcher of Plainfield died quietly in his hospital bed in 1984, taking many secrets with him to the grave. But his legacy lives on, not just in the horror movies and true crime documentaries that continue to fascinate audiences, but in the ongoing struggle to understand and prevent the kind of systematic evil he represented. Ed Gein wasn't just a killer, he was a symptom of deeper problems that continue to plague society today. The case of Ed Gein remains officially closed, but the questions it raises about justice, community responsibility, and the nature of evil itself continue to demand answers. Until we're willing to confront these uncomfortable truths, we remain vulnerable to the next Ed Gein, the next quiet neighbor whose basement contains horrors beyond imagination. The price of ignorance, as Plainfield learned too late, is measured in innocent lives and shattered communities. In the end, Ed Gein's true horror, not in the gruesome details of his crimes, but in the realization that such monsters can hide among us for years, protected by our own reluctance to see what we don't want to believe. The farmhouse may be gone, but the darkness it contained continues to cast shadows over American society, reminding us that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and violence. Sometimes it simply knocks on the door of a hardware store on a quiet November morning and asks to buy Anna Freeze. The story I've shared with you tonight represents just the beginning of what I know about the Ed Gein case. There are documents still sealed, witnesses still living, and connections still unexplored. The truth about what happened in Plainfield is larger and more disturbing than anyone has dared to reveal publicly, but that's a story for another time, assuming I remain safe enough to tell it. For now, remember this. In every small town across America, there are basements and farmhouses where unspeakable things might be happening right now, hidden from view by nothing more than our collective unwillingness to ask the hard questions. The dead of Plainfield deserve better than to be forgotten or reduced to horror movie tropes. Their names were Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, and they were real people whose lives were cut short by evil that should have been stopped long before it reached them. Remember them, question the official stories, and never assume that the monsters only exist in movies. Sometimes they're your neighbors, your customers, your fellow church members, ordinary people hiding extraordinary darkness behind familiar faces. This has been an investigation into truth, justice, and the price of willful blindness. Stay vigilant, stay questioning, and remember that the safety of our communities depends on our willingness to confront uncomfortable realities about the capacity for evil that exists in all of us. The story of Ed Gein is over, but the lessons it teaches remain urgently relevant in a world where new monsters are born every day. Until next time, this has been your anonymous guide through the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of American life. Stay safe, stay skeptical, and never stop asking why.